Good evening. That was incredibly weak. Good evening. All right, thank you. My name is Peter Blackmer. I'm with the Detroit Equity Action Lab. It's good to see you all out here tonight. Before I introduce the panelists, we have a great session planned for tonight. Mass incarceration is an incredibly pressing issue in Detroit, in the state, in the region, in the nation. It's something that we all need to be sure that we are reckoning with in our work, whatever that work looks like. So just to introduce this session very briefly, I want to make sure I leave the majority of this time for our panelists who are experts in the topic. I want to just ground us as we approach this topic within the arc of the series that we've been going through. So now we're in the sixth week of this series of Detroit to Speak. So I want to talk a little bit about where this particular class session fits in with the arc that we've been following so far. So in this session, we are going to analyze the rise of mass incarceration in Detroit and its many costs, right, from the personal and the communal to the economic and the political. So far in the class series, we've taken a deep dive into the histories of race and policing in Detroit and in the United States, and moved forward into discussions of the roles of policing, surveillance, incarceration, in containing populations, displacing communities, and suppressing challenges to political, economic, and the social status quo. When we look back at some of these histories that we talked about so far in policing in the United States, we can clearly see defined patterns of periods of social movements and unrest, followed very swiftly by waves of escalating police power, equipment, and institutions. This is generally how an oppressive system responds to challenges to the system, right? And that's something that we've spent some time looking at, whether that's with the policing of Black power, the surveillance and containment in the city of Detroit, and looking at the different ways that different identities and different populations are specifically targeted by police actions in Detroit. So I'm not going to go too deeply into that because I'm going to leave that to the panelists to flesh out. We're really building on centuries of criminalizing African Americans specifically and non-white people generally. This backlash to social movements really occurred at the height of the civil rights movement with the emergence of stop and frisk programs, counterintelligence programs like COINTELPRO, which we talked about last week, and the militarization of local police forces during the war on crime. During this time, policing and incarceration were also used really as perverse responses to dealing with a surplus of labor due to automation and a dwindling manufacturing sector of the economy, which really disproportionately impacted Black and brown people due to discriminatory hiring practices and layoff practices. And now, with the rise of privatized prisons in our society, these processes have really been incentivized by profit and supported by a racist justice system. So this is a lot that we've been talking about over the course of this series, right? So in recent years, we've had a lot of landmark books come out that have really put the rise of mass incarceration in the mind, the rise of mass incarceration in the mid to late 20th century into popular conversation. So books like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. We can show of hands who's come in contact with this book. All right. The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. See some more hands? All right, less with that. And From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime by Elizabeth Hinton. Any other hands? All right, so we got some homework to do. All right, so these works have really come out alongside a lot of work that's being done on the ground by activists and organizers across the country that's putting a national spotlight on the oppressive and inhumane impacts of hyper-policing and mass incarceration. So since we're here in Detroit, and since this city has been so deeply impacted by these policies, these programs, and institutions that have directly targeted people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ communities, folks with disabilities and mental health issues, tonight we're going to put the spotlight on Detroit. All right. So first, we're going to take a dive into some of the histories of policing and mass incarceration in the city to ground our discussion within that historical context. And then move into exploring the many costs of mass incarceration and the ways that communities in Detroit and beyond are organizing to resist oppressive policing and the carceral state, and to envision new notions of safety and security. All right. So that's my spiel. Now I want to introduce the distinguished speakers that we have coming in tonight. Alia Harvey-Quinn is the director of Force Detroit. Born and raised in Detroit, she began working in the nonprofit sector as a volunteer performance poet, visual artist, and instructor. Then moving from creating art about community issues to working to positively impact these issues, Alia dedicated 14 years to the nonprofit field, working and volunteering in many schools, community centers, and churches across metropolitan Detroit. Mrs. Harvey-Quinn is passionate about community organizing, arts education, social justice, and media creation that centers communities as the experts and narrators of their own stories. Mrs. Harvey-Quinn is proud to count among her successes founding Force, a project of the Faith in Action Network, uniquely designed to primarily engage returning citizens and millennials in Detroit, and co-founding Detroit Future Youth, a youth-led organization of over a dozen justice-based media organizing nonprofits. Detroit Future Youth, supported 10 organizations with $300,000 of funding and engaged over 2,000 young Detroiters in media education and arts creation experiences online over a 16-month period from 2011 to 2012. Leah is also responsible for the development and management of multiple youth entrepreneurial art programs that engaged youth in community activism and resulted in the production of 15 community murals, 2 spoken word and hip-hop CDs highlighting issues of youth identity and social justice, 2 volumes of poetry, an art gallery, as well as several graphically enhanced products. Troy Rienstra is Outreach Director for Safe and Just Michigan. Troy joined Safe and Just Michigan in 2017 and works to advance the organization's outreach program by elevating the voices of people directly harmed by the effects of crime and punishment. He is responsible for outreach activities to crime survivors, formerly incarcerated individuals, and their family members, and the faith community. Prior to serving as Outreach Director, Troy founded the Network for Real Change and worked as Program Coordinator at the Church of the Servant, Prisoners in Christ. Rienstra completed 22 years of a life sentence in Michigan, and during that time, he obtained training in critical thinking, communication, substance abuse awareness, and conflict resolution. And Michael Stauch is an assistant professor of history at the University of Toledo. Mike is a historian of policing, politics, and social movements in the United States, with a particular interest in the categories of race, youth, and labor. His research examines the emergence of the carceral state from below in Detroit during the 1970s and 1980s in a manuscript entitled Young Detroit, Policing the Community During the War on Crime. He received his PhD in U.S. history from Duke University in 2015 and teaches courses in American and African American history. All right, so can we please welcome our panelists into our community classroom. All right, so that's enough talking for me. I'm going to pass this over. And to give you an idea about the structure for tonight, we're going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to speak, about 15, 20 minutes. We're going to move into a facilitated conversation and then open it up for question and answer of the audience. Sound good? Cool. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Mike to speak first.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll stand over here. Sorry. No worries, no worries. Okay. Well, I'll see how this works. So I'm knocking all kinds of stuff over. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me. My thanks to David Goldberg at Wayne State University for getting me involved in this project. Craig and Marion at Semester in Detroit. Peter Hammer with the Detroit Equity Action Lab, and of course Peter Blackmer here with Deal as well. And it's always nice to be. It's always a pleasure to be the least distinguished member of a panel like this. So I'm really happy to be here. It also functions as sort of a homecoming for me because I went to Wayne State University, got my undergraduate degree here, did a postdoc at U of M. So I feel like I'm among colleagues and friends, I hope. Okay, so my project is the broad project. I know it's called, I said Young Detroit or whatever, but it sort of covers the period from stress to malice in Detroit police reform, right? The idea that, well, I think you guys are probably familiar with stress to some extent, right? Also familiar with Malice Green. To some extent, I would argue that he dies as a result of community policing initiatives that are closely related to broken windows policing. And it's my task today to kind of suss out some of those connections in Detroit history. And I cover this period that seems little discussed, right? Coleman Young's police reform initiatives. And I have a few things to say about that. I'm going to just kind of lay the groundwork today with the early origins. My research, the whole project covers things like the Livernois disturbance on the near northwest side in 1975, the Cobo Hall incident, mass robbery in 1976, Young Boys Incorporated, a bunch of young people selling drugs on Detroit streets, and then goes into Operation Crack Crime, So Sad, or Save Our Sons and Daughters. So those are some of the incidents that I kind of cover in the broader project, but I'll kind of just lay some groundwork here, and hopefully that'll be something that helps us have a discussion about this stuff. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the promise of Coleman Young, right? So Coleman Young is elected in 1973 on the sort of back of some of the most significant incidents between police and the black community in the history of the city, right? Not only 1967 and the sort of uprising then, but also the Kirchville mini riot in '66. The incident with Officer Spicer around that same time. But those are the kinds of things that give us a sense of the kind of fraught relationship between the police and the black community in Detroit preceding Coleman Young's election. Other incidents include, of course, the insurrection in July '67. Some nice pictures of Black Power scrawled there. The military occupation of Detroit in July 1967. I don't have to focus too closely on this, but I do want to point out some things that get overlooked sometimes, like an incident at Veterans Memorial Building where there was young people, black and white, attending two separate high school dances, right? And in the midst of this, the police officers allege that one of the African-American kids says something to one of the white girls that's attending this dance, and then it becomes this incident where these white police officers, attack and get into this big kind of conflagration with all these like black children, essentially, right? Teenagers attending this dance. That's another thing that happens in 1968, November 1968. In 1968 as well, Mayor Kavanaugh begins to introduce stop and frisk procedures. This is the Supreme Court had recently made its Terry versus Ohio ruling, which allowed stop and frisk to kind of come back into officers' interactions with communities. So that was a really significant development that has an effect later. And then, of course, stress, right? There's this stop the robberies in Enjoy Safe Streets, which is essentially an entrapment operation. Won't go into it too much. But the key thing that's really significant about stress is that it sparks a movement in the city against stress, a multiracial movement, a very powerful movement in which the left plays a really significant role and is kind of giving some ideas about how police reform in the future might function, right? Really important development. You even get pamphlets like Detroit Under Stress written by some of these left-wing groups that were really influential in this movement, right? Now, another thing that's taking place at this time, which is very significant, is the emergence of a new orthodoxy in policing. So after all of these major incidents in cities across the country, reformers are like, what can we do about this? How can we change or transform policing to make these kinds of things not happen anymore, right? One of the examples is the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment. This happens in 1972, where they sort of examine the effect that routine auto patrol has on crime, the incidence of crime. Does it make crime go down, and does it make people feel safer? In both cases, they found that it did not have any significant effect on either of those things. So these routine auto patrols, riding around neighborhoods in marked cars, did not have an effect on crime, nor did it have an effect on making people feel safer. Note also, one of the people that was responsible for writing this, George Kelling, right? That name comes up later. The Newark Foot Patrol experiment. Again, the question is, does it decrease crime? Does it make people feel safer? In this instance, they followed the introduction of foot patrols into Newark, which had experienced an uprising on a scale similar to Detroit's. And what they found was it, again, didn't really decrease crime, but did change how people felt about the safety of their communities. It made people feel safer. So that was a significant development. And this is kind of, you're getting a sense of the emergence of a new orthodoxy in policing. Maybe we should move away from those routine patrols and marked police cars, and maybe we should move toward foot patrols in neighborhoods with police that are kind of involved in the community and all this kind of stuff. Coleman Young is directly involved at the center of all this kind of stuff. He, in his campaign for election in 1973, he runs on a program to introduce community policing, essentially. He says he wants to build a people's police department, right? What that means is he's introducing a shift from this riot-inducing professionalization or professionalism, right? Which we might know from movies or film, TV series like Dragnet. That's kind of like the epitome of professional policing, where they're like, oh, you violated paragraph 38, section 4, and that's why, that's the police professionalism that is understood or thought to be responsible for these riots, right? So we're moving away from that. Coleman Young says, let's build a people's police department. We'll have a residency requirement for officers. We'll recruit African-American people that are part of the community to be involved in the police department. We'll train people about how to interact with the community in ways that aren't as offensive as in the past. And we'll actually get the community involved as much as possible. And he says in one of his campaign messages, I want to recruit a great corps of citizen volunteers to be involved in policing, right? And he says another thing that I think is very significant in one of his campaign speeches. He calls it law and order with justice. So he still wants law and order. So he's kind of giving something to the kind of mood at the time, but with justice. And he says, law and order with justice cannot be imposed without the cooperation and confidence of the people. So that's what he's trying to do with his community policing initiatives and this idea of building a people's police department. There's also, I want to take a step back for a moment and talk about the metropolitan approach to police reform. Now, if you take a look at this quote real quick, it gives you a sense of how Young understood Detroit's position vis-a-vis other cities in the United States. He was very nervous about the competitive nature of the sort of struggle for business, to recruit businesses to invest in your communities, right? And we're familiar with this from Tom Segru. All these businesses are leaving Detroit to go for low-wage, low-tax, anti-union places in the South, or they're moving their businesses to parts of the suburbs and things like that, right? At the same time, the federal government is subsidizing the creation of highways to move people between those places, defense spending that'll kind of transform the military from one version to another. And at the same time, the federal government would be more willing to give money increasingly to police programs, police initiatives, than to social services, right? So you have a kind of transformation of the way the state functions in this period that is also really significant. That's some of the stuff that Coleman Young is grappling with when he's thinking about how he's going to attract business to Detroit. And now the other thing that's taking place, and this is a really fascinating depiction of household income in the metro area in 2010, right? And the deepest red is households that make $0 to $30,000, and the deepest blue is households that make $102,000 or more, right, per year. And you get a sense from this of the effect that economic transformation has had on the metropolitan area in several ways. One is deindustrialization, which we're familiar with. The second is suburbanization, people leaving the city, taking their tax money with them, right? And the third that I think is really important but doesn't get talked about too much is the financialization of the American economy, where, for example, one of the things that's taking place here is it's a decline in access to unskilled labor because that labor is moving, whereas at the same time, the white-collar work is increasing tremendously. In the metropolitan area of Detroit, from 1940 to 1990, the amount of white-collar jobs doubles, right? At the same time as these factories are leaving. And that gives us some sense of where this income inequality comes from. This is the big context that structures the reforms that Coleman Young pursues. Now, at the same time, a lot of those reforms establish a continuity with the past that is really important. So Senator Young vows law and order stand. And again, if you can get a sense of this, he says, in some half-hour television show, any hoodlum, any thug, black or white, will get no sympathy from me. So he's trying to establish his law and order bona fides because his opponent, of course, is John Nichols, who is the architect of or presided over the creation of stress. So if it's going to be a campaign about police reform, Coleman Young wants to make it clear that he's going to be a law and order candidate. This is also important because this is a flyer that circulated from the Young Committee at the time, where he calls John Nichols out about crime. He said, as you can see, robberies increased 25%, homicides 80%, total crime 14%. So again, you see Young positioning himself as someone who's going to be tougher on crime than arguably the toughest on crime figure in the history of the city, right, John Nichols. So you have that. Now, Another thing that's significant, so Young, a part of his campaign, during his campaign, he says, I'll abolish stress. I'm even going to fire John Nichols, right, because he was the commissioner of the police department. I'm going to fire John Nichols. He does that. He doesn't fire John Nichols, but he abolishes stress in Executive Order Number 2. At the very same time, in that same executive order, just to give you a sense of the continuity, he says there should be mounted an all-out war on crime. Right? So just as he abolishes stress, he says, and we should also, by the way, mount an all-out war on crime. In his first State of the City address in 1975, after he's been in office for a year, he boasts that the police department has arrested more people than have ever been arrested in the history of the city. Next year, he would top that, right? So you get a sense of how he's angling as a tough on crime person at the same time as he's promoting these community policing reforms, right? Community policing, police in a different way. So the big issue that comes is, what difference does community policing make? And I'll talk about a few things, a few differences that I think community policing makes. One is it expands a city's carceral footprint, right? In the first 100 days of Coleman Young's administration, he creates 2 mini stations. By the end of the first year, 15 are in place. Year 2, he gets a $441,000 federal grant. Year 4, 42. Year 6, 50. 50 was his goal. By year 6, he's got his 50 mini stations. Just to give you a sense of how this looks in the sort of what I've called this carceral footprint, I have a couple of slides which begin with, and I apologize if it's not too clear, but you can see, these are the precincts, the police precincts that existed in 74 before Coleman Young starts his mini station program. At the end of 74, he's already put in these various other mini stations, right? So you've got, what you have here is police stations in darker blue, and then the lighter blue is the mini stations that he's creating. So what you're starting to see is more and more police in more parts of the city. And then by the end of 77, it's increased dramatically, right? So then what you get, and here's a comparative approach, is between 74 and 77, with just the precincts on the top and then the precincts plus the mini stations below, he's introduced quite a bit of police presence into the city where it didn't exist before, right? And he's changing the way that policing works as well, and that's another issue that community policing does. It emphasizes class in enforcement. So what you'll have often is the enforcement of nuisance misdemeanors, things like, well, that I'll get to, that seek to enforce a type of order that they claim derives from the community, but at the same time targets the social practices of a sort of growing sector of unemployed people in the city, right? Which is particularly significant because, as I've kind of noted with this income inequality stuff that's happening, Detroit is arguably the place in the country where the most people are becoming unemployed fastest. And so then you introduce into that milieu all these mini stations and then ask them to enforce a class-focused order that emphasizes the social practices of the poor. There you have it. Another thing community policing does is it obscures difference within a given community. So, for example, it's important to ask who makes up the community. Who is it that is the community when we talk about community policing? And this is something that I get from scholars like Ula Taylor, who's actually giving a talk today elsewhere, and I apologize that you guys are here and you can't hear her speak about women in the Nation of Islam, because it's very, very good scholarship that she does, and it's inspired my own work, which is about focusing on the heterogeneity within the African American community on the basis of, for example, sexuality or gender, how those things differently impact how people experience the world as African American people, but in my work, in particular, class, right? So what difference does it make to be unemployed versus a homeowner in this context in Detroit, right? So that's really important. And the key point here is when we talk about what the community is, if we ignore this difference within the black community, we're overlooking how law enforcement reinforces pre-existing hierarchies, right? So we're not focusing on the way that law enforcement itself enforces those hierarchies that exist in communities. I think that's important. In particular, because when you read the Broken Windows article by Kelly and Wilson, one of the things that they say is the panhandler is in effect the first broken window, right? So they make a clear distinction between homeless people panhandling for money and shopkeepers, homeowners, things like that. All of those class biases are kind of inherent within policing practices. A couple more real quick. Community policing naturalizes the presence of law enforcement in our daily lives. We've seen this in the Neighborhood Real-Time Intelligence Program from Mayor Duggan, right? He says things like, we support the expansion of crime-fighting technology into Detroit neighborhoods, and he wants you to sign this thing, right? That's a way of introducing law enforcement into some pretty intimate spaces of our social lives when it doesn't exist already. In the past, we see under Coleman Young, foot patrols, a focus on minor offenses, like I've mentioned, educational and recreational programs for young people, community organizing projects, like Duggan just mentioned. It's not easy to see this, but this is a proposed foot patrol route for the Brewster Douglas housing projects. Many of the mini stations were located in high poverty areas and housing projects. So that gives you again, a sense of the class biases that inform this policing effort. And what you see here, when you look at the red line, the police officers from the mini stations were supposed to walk this route twice an hour, right? So twice an hour, they're walking through all the nooks and crannies of high poverty areas, looking for and then enforcing misdemeanor stuff, right? It has a really important effect on crime in the city. Here's me. This is from young people. The point that I wanted to bring up about this was the criminalization. Another important factor in community policing is how it criminalizes youth, right? And the reason I put this up is not just to be facetious, but also to mention that when I was playing softball, I did not have to worry about whether or not the coach was a police officer and whether or not I would, by telling him things, personal stuff about my family members or people that I knew from the neighborhood, I would be turned into an informant or a collaborator or even the way that as a young person, maybe I'm criminalized by the way I look or the places I live or the people I associate with, right? I did not, you can tell by my dopey smile that I did not have those kinds of things on my mind in this picture, right? And that's a significant difference between, I grew up just north of 8 Mile. I wasn't that far from where this stuff is happening, and yet my social experience was very different, right? Just real quick, I want to mention this, one night's prowl in the city streets, because it gives you a sense of how youth were criminalized. So this article focuses on a bunch of 6 young people who are on a corner in the city that are kind of harassed by law enforcement, and they said they're suspected gang members. There's all this kind of stuff happening. My big point here is that community policing also transforms how people in the city experience space. It undermines their access to public space. I won't get into it. I can talk about it a little bit in comments and stuff, but community policing does, in fact, undermine how youth in particular, but also poor people are able to access public spaces, and this does have implications for Detroit today. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to turn it over to Alia now.
Hey, I've got him wiggling on my knee. I apologize for it. So I was asked to present on the experiential costs of mass incarceration. And so I feel like, I used to be a poet and we used to have to give disclaimers before we went up and did our thing, right? There is no way to comprehensively present on experiential costs of mass incarceration, right? They're numerous, and mind-boggling and individual and all of this stuff. And I also must say that while I may be an expert at being a child of a person who's incarcerated and what that experience might look like, I've never myself been incarcerated. And so as I share some of my insights. I'm sharing what I have learned from other people's experience, which may or may not be accurate, and I am open to dialogue and critique. So that was my disclaimer. So I wanted to share on 3 areas. I wanted to talk about otherization. I wanted to talk about trauma. And I wanted to talk about new and emerging sort of like social trends as a result of mass incarceration. So first and foremost, I'm the director of Forest Detroit. And all of my work is based on the notion that criminalization is both structural and forced in Detroit. And so based on, my research, there are 4 ways, Detroit is one of the most impoverished cities in America. It's also one of the most highly black cities. Between black and brown populations, we're over 85% of the city, right? So that doesn't seem coincidental at all, right? And so in this city, you've got an educational system that has made nationwide news for being gutted, right? Like it's a subpar system. A few years back, a judge declared illiteracy not a right after 12 years of education. So while it is still a legal mandate that our children attend school, my children homeschool, that our children attend school, it is not a legal, a parent's legal right to enforce that their child leave those 12 years of school literate, right? And so then another thing, Detroit was known for low skill, high wage labor. And, that is a system that has been gutted, right? So now the schools are churning out young people that are increasingly low skilled without sources for them to, be employed meaningfully, right? So that's another area that somebody could have previously gotten out of poverty that they can no longer access, right? And then another route would be a social arrangement, right? You could get a mentor that could walk you into a career. You could marry up. However, Detroit is one of America's most segregated cities, right? So that's an option that we don't have. The 4th and last option out of poverty that I found that we rarely talk about is criminal activity, right? And there are lots of, yes, sir. There are lots of populations that routinely engage in criminal activity without being reprimanded as severely as black and brown populations, right? Like we have white collar crime, which, usually are not, black and brown folks doing that. There's there are sorority guys raping women and getting slaps on the wrist, right? Like national news, right? And so, that is the framework for all of my work. That is the common theme that you will find in it as I share today. So my conversation will lean a lot towards, the ultimate impact of mass incarceration being the criminalization of a whole community. And so I'm going to start with otherization. And I'm sure you all know what otherization is, but I'm going to just shoot my shot and share this definition I got right here on this hot piece of paper. It's a common practice among propaganda spreaders, the intent of which is to separate a group or individual with the effect of ostracizing and degrading them. And so, like, the first rule of propaganda is to dehumanize the enemy by pointing out differences. And so, like, as we think about the process that we learn about right and wrong, and we think about communities that are heavily criminalized, as they're digesting this information, what are they learning about themselves, right? So, like, I remember now, I obviously grew up with a criminal parent, right? And there was my father was in prison for 27 years. My godfathers were in prison. My cousins were in prison. So I was surrounded by sort of a criminal culture, right? And I remember, watching America's Most Wanted. It was my favorite show at one point in my life. Until I saw my godfathers on America's Most Wanted. And the fact that they depicted my godfathers as such evil men did not usurp me of the memories that I had of them. It didn't negate all the times that I had seen them be superhumane to me and my sisters. And, matter of fact, I eventually converted to Islam, and the man who first introduced me to Islam is in a federal facility right now. So then this, like when you learn sort of these concepts in a school in a real polarizing way, right and wrong, good and bad as completely opposite, then you start to wonder how you fit in. Where do you fall on this scale if everybody in your world is this other thing, right? And so then what happens is the complete sort of like ostracization and volunteer otherization of a whole entire community. So I wear my seatbelt. Look, for no reason, y'all, have never been abused, hate police to this day. But I grew up going to see my father and being patted down and not understanding. There is no other context where they treat children as potential threats the way they do in prison. There is no other, like when Dad, would you? Yeah, can you go to Pop Pop? Pop Pop? So there is no other context where children are regarded as potentially evil, patted down, not spoken to kindly, subject to militaristic rules in this way that children are when they engage their parents in prison. It's already traumatic to not leave with your parent. So like, I'm the oldest. I have 3 sisters. We had starkly different responses to this. I'm an activist. I had my littlest sister, she smuggled in a plastic knife. What was it, Daddy? Was it a plastic knife? It was a play tool set, and she was going to break them out. She's a Capricorn. She's a little headstrong. She was that way even when she was little. And so, Dad is, yeah, she was a trip. She still is. So Daddy talked her out of it. We're all crying. My little sister, Najanava, asked, who has the power to let you out? My dad said a judge. That was the day that she decided that she wanted to be a judge. And then my other, middle sister decided to identify with criminal culture in an entirely different way. Like she went through acts of rebellion in her teenage years, and then when she was threatened with, you know how parents do, you're gonna wind up, well, she said one time, it'll be fine, I'll wind up in prison, at least I'll get to see my dad. No, so there's this like volunteer otherization that children undergo when they when they're no, honey, y'all sit down, do something. Y'all can sit down. You don't have to pick him up, honey. Yeah. Okay, y'all. So, I mean, and then when you think about how we learn this and how subtle it is, right? There are video games, like right now on Subway Surfer, the black character is like doing handstands and wearing gold chains, and everybody else is just like regular, you know? And then when we see these videos, it's not just black people, it's brown people too. Like a lot of the video games are shooting people with accents, right? Like they're shooting people who are visibly browner than the protagonist. Hey, don't eat the food off the ground, sir. Okay, that's okay. If you want to fall out, you can. Don't eat the food. And then children's games like Cops and Robbers, that didn't happen in my neighborhood. Nobody wanted to be the cop. Nobody was doing that. And TV made it like super apparent that there was a difference. I mean, because like, what was the difference between the 3 girls in my home, and why did they have so many damn fathers? Who had this many men in their homes? Like, y'all got extra fathers? Just jumping out of places? Uncle Steve? Like, you know, we didn't have that. And so then, you know, other systems arise as a result. So like, if you feel like the other and you feel like calling the police when you're in need of a police authority is a danger to yourself, then what happens is, you know, you create a replacement for the police authority, right? Like street justice happens. And then that results in cyclical, persistent violence. And then there are, you know, and then there are alternative financial systems, like with human costs, right? So, hey, have a seat, sir. Sit down. That's right. Sit down. That's okay. So like, if there was not, we just gonna talk like he's not crying, and I'm gonna use the mic well. So then, if there was not a 40% crime rate, if there was not an almost 40% poverty rate in Detroit, and if children weren't experiencing poverty at 57% in Detroit, it might be possible that, you know, human trafficking wouldn't be a form of business. It might be possible that, so many of the things that we see in the city, like the carjackings, the harm that is actually, unspeakable, the robberies, the people defending themselves and dying just to keep their hard-earned money. All of that is a fallout of an inability to access a legitimate economic system, right? Like, there's a whole alternative economy, and the fallout is actually death. And then there's also, the obvious, which is the loss of wage-earning adults in homes. And then there's trauma, which I almost don't want to cover because there is no way to be exhaustive with trauma, right, in this area. There are folks that end up in isolation and never make it back mentally because it's just not human to be in social isolation that long. So they're the individual sort of like traumas, but then there are the like individual traumas that have collective impact. And so those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. There's this like fear. There's the fear of like ostracization on the behalf of children, right? Like, there was me, I was running around, y'all, like before my father got out of prison. He got out in 2012. Him right there, he's an activist. And yeah, whatever. So I introduced him to this network of folks that I work with because they're all activists too, right? And then, so I'm off using words like awesome. And he bust me out at work, in front of my peers. He was like, she ain't like this at home. She ain't nothing awesome at home. She don't talk like that. I don't even know her here. But there was yeah, you are, just slightly. But there was a fear on several people's parts, I think, that if you share this part of your life, like this very real, gritty part of your life, that you don't even have a place in your career, which is community work. Like, you don't even want to say how impacted you are when you're trying to help. Like, you want to be like, I remember to the young people that I worked with, I remember being like, I'm just like you, in a very low-key kind of way. And then when we, there were a few powerful moments in youth work where, I was teaching poetry. I ended up with a group full of young Black men who wanted to be rappers on the North End neighborhood. And we ended up in several sessions where I would push them to write about topics that were not, sex, money, drugs. And so, one of the topics was, what is the role of, Black men in America? What is the role of Black women in America, in our society? How do we heal? We used to write on topics like that. And in the conversation about the role of Black men, the boys broke down and started crying because they didn't know. They didn't have fathers. They didn't know how to shave. And we had built pretty, trusting, intense relationships. So, they felt comfortable talking to me like that. So then we started writing my dad together in those poetry sessions. And then he would respond. And, him and the people who were in a parenting class that he was teaching, they would respond. So that was all social ostracization of peers. There are children afraid that their parents are just gone. There are children who have mothers who are incarcerated that have wound up in state facilities with family members who are 5 more minutes, who are not very nurturing. There's a fear of returning to prison for people who have been, a fear of not being able to adjust to societal changes, right? Like the upkeep in technology, not knowing how to use a credit card, not knowing how to relate to family members when they need to be tender, right? And there's a fear that children will repeat patterns. There's a culture of violence. Imagine surviving a hostile environment for blocks of years, and the fight or flight mode being constantly on, and what that does to your adrenaline and to your ability to respond to aggression. So in returning citizens or justice impacted folks' lives, there are higher incidences of domestic violence to children and spouses, or just violence in general, because there is a trigger, there's a trauma there that They don't get to heal from. There is no PTSD for returning citizens. There isn't counseling made widely available. And then there's, institutionalization, which can look like the preference of prison-based social systems where you feel like you matter, where you understand things. And then there's potentially a replication of familial connections in prison as ties to biological family members are lost. I was supposed to tell more stories. I don't know what happened to my time. And so then I wanted to end on a lighter note because this stuff is intense. There are also like some weird cultural responses to mass incarceration, right? In the dating world, there's the presence of polygamy as a potential savior system for Black women. Y'all, I could tell you some stories, I won't. There's the deification of regularness, like I mean that's some stuff that me and my homegirls talk about, right? Like that's a self-coined term. If you use it, quote me. Like so, there are brothers who have met the same sort of like life goals and life standards that we have, and sort of like deify themselves because they have done the same things we have but haven't gone to prison. And so they feel like, they're the cream of the crop, and a lot of times they feel like they're entitled to multiple women because of it. Because they, instead of comparing themselves to their potential partner, they compare themselves to their peers. And then there is prison as an alternative rites of passage, and the pervasiveness of honor systems that are based on surviving prison. So there's like the replication of fraternity type relationships through prison bonds. And then there are, as a last note, there are, for children young people who have been impacted by, incarceration, there's the appearance of family members who have really, really strong ties to your parent, who essentially know you, watched you grow up, that you never got a chance to meet and that you don't know, but they feel warmly towards you like a godfather or uncle. So,
Okay, so lastly, I'm Troy Rienstra, Outreach Director with Safe and Just Michigan. I'm following 2 clinics. I've just been talked about. As Peter said in a little bit of biographical information about me, I have served 30 years within the Michigan correctional system. I started off when I was 15 years old, matriculated into the adult system at 18 years old, served 5 years, couldn't figure it out, A year and a half later, I went back to prison with a parolable life term for armed robbery. I come out of the Muskegon County, myself and 3 other co-defendants decided one day that it would be a good idea to rob a jewelry store. So we did. The owner was shot 5 times. Fortunately, he survived. But consequently, we received over 115 years in prison collectively. My co-defendant was given 52 to 85 years. He was 19 when he shot the store owner, and he will not see the parole board until he serves 50 years. He was a little bit mentally challenged. He was taken advantage of in that situation, and consequently, he will probably die in prison because of his condition. So this is the type of system that we like to address at Safe and Just Michigan. How do we as a state serve more time in prison than any other state? In Michigan, if you go to prison, you will serve on average 127% of your sentence that you're given. So for instance, if you're given a 10-year sentence, you'll probably serve 12 years and 7 months. So that's the type of work that we do to try to address that issue, among others. How do you spend $1 per higher education to $3 per incarceration? Alia described a lot of the circumstances people deal with as a result of the criminal justice system. We see how the criminal justice system has evolved over time. In the early 80s, Michigan had approximately 5,000 people who were in prison. In the late 90s, it rose to almost 50,000 prisoners. How does that happen over a 2-decade span? It goes to what Mike was describing, that there are strategies, that there's political interests, that there's a monetary interest to people having people incarcerated. We use the term mass incarceration. One thing that we do at Safe and Just Michigan is we like to challenge the overuse of incarceration to deal with problems. So another thing that I'd like to touch on is what Alia mentioned was trauma. So people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go kill somebody, rape somebody, maim somebody, rob a bank. Whatever it is that they do that may wind them up to be in the criminal justice system, people just don't wake up that way. They've either seen, heard, or experienced something that shaped their core beliefs that made it justifiable for them to go commit some type of act against another person to fulfill or meet their own need. So one of the things that we like to do is to create partnerships with organizations who are working at the community level who deal with the issue of trauma. We call it pre-incarceration or potentially pre-incarceration. It starts off with one of the things that motivated me to get into this work, apart from being incarcerated, apart from sitting in a solitary confinement cell for 6 years straight, 23 hours a day, was little buddy here. After I read a report by the Bureau of Judicial Statistics where they can project, this was in 2012, that 1 of every 3 African American boys born will spend time within the criminal justice system. That 1 of every 8 Hispanic or Latino, Latinx children born will spend time inside of the criminal justice system. And 1 of every 12 Caucasian young men born in 2012 will spend time in the criminal justice system. So if you can project and go to Hurley Hospital or Spectrum or Mercy or wherever children are born in the Detroit area and look at the children laying in the natal care unit and say 1, 2, you, 1, 2, you. There's some form of responsibility, moral, personal, social responsibility that comes along with that projection. So how do we invest in the prevention of that becoming what do you call it? Prophecy? Self-fulfilling prophecy. A socially fulfilling prophecy. How do you prevent that from happening? So that's what we like to do. We like to work with communities who are at work. I just told Alia, we just put her name on the board. We're doing some power mapping to address a certain campaign that we're working on. And there needs to be better collaboration within the organizations who are at the community level working to address the issue of the overuse of incarceration, which leads to the outcome, mass incarceration, that we're talking about today. So just a little bit more about myself before I get into my work. I spent 22 years in prison for armed robbery. Ironically, while I'm in solitary confinement, I read a lot. I happened to come across a report written by the organization that I work for today, which is formerly known as Citizens Alliance on Prisons and Public Spending. CAPS. It's too long of a name, so we decided to rebrand last year. Safe and Just Mission. But the report that I read did some research on length of stay. And they said people serving a parolable term in the state of Michigan will serve on average 42.7 years when the statute says that a person is eligible for parole at 10 years. So go figure. So there were policies that the parole board had that led to the increase of length of stay, because actually that's over 30 years over a person's eligible release date. So there was a policy that came along where it said life means life. We have two different types of life sentences in the state of Michigan. You have parolable life and natural life. Natural life comes at the cost of a capital offense, and at one point it just came from having too much dope. You have over 350 grams of cocaine, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. So one of the things that we like to take pride in is working under the executive director, recently retired Laura Sager, who was with an organization called FAM. And what FAM did is FAM worked to challenge the mandatory minimum, primarily on the issue of drug law, the 650 gram drug law. And that was overturned. And now today there's only one person who remains in prison who was sentenced to a life term in Michigan for having over 650 grams of cocaine. Most recently, we were able to overturn or amend another law introduced. We call it objective parole. So another thing that would happen when you go see the parole board, which led to the increase, the spike in the prison number, was there weren't so many more people who were going to prison, is that people were going to prison and they couldn't get out. So it's easy to get in, it's hard to get out. It's like the flat track. So what would happen is the police, you would go see the parole board at your earliest release date, and they say, no interest. See me in 24 months. Or they would say, poor prognosis. See me in 18 months. Or they would say, you're con-wise. That was the actual term that they would use to say that people are manipulating the system because they didn't get in trouble while they were there. So these would be causes to extend justifications to extend a person's stay. So what objective parole did, which came into effect December or January of this year, was today when you go up for the parole board, they have to give you an outline of what it is that you need to accomplish based upon the recommendations that were made for you to accomplish in order for you to be released. If you have, they must give just cause to not release you. If you have not, they must give you a clear path to be released. And once you come back after 12 months, if you have accomplished that, they shall release you from prison. And so that's one of the things that we've done to challenge the spike and the maintenance of a high population rate in the state of Michigan. So what we are a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We'll work with anybody who wants to change the criminal justice system. Today we're working as a coalition with a national organization called Just Leadership. We have funders who are national foundations who are funding our work, and we're working on a project called Clean Slate. So is anybody familiar with expungement? Yeah? Okay. So expungement has its value if you qualify, and if you use it. So a report was recently done by two people from the University of Michigan. I can't remember the name, so I can't quote it. But one thing that they determined in their study is that 95% of people in the state of Michigan who qualify for expungement don't use it. Only 5% of people who qualify use it. And of those people, the number is lower who successfully do it because it's an arbitration process. So in the state of Michigan, if you have more than one felony, that's why people who understand the criminal justice system say that there is no one felony case. So it's like if you got dope, you got a gun. Or if you're fleeing the lube, you resist arrest. So there's always these two charges or multiple charges that they call it overcharging, so that when you plead out to a lesser offense, but you still have multiple offenses. So if you have more than one felony in the state of Michigan or 2 misdemeanors, you don't qualify for expungement. So how can I ever get it off my record if I pled out to 3 or 4 charges? It just doesn't happen. So our campaign now is, and for the rest of this year, and hopefully we'll see success under Whitmer governor, is we're working on a project called Clean Slate, which also includes expanding expungement. So I'll segue into a brief video that outlines what happened in the state of Pennsylvania and how it's spreading across the country, and I'll tell you about how we're trying to implement that here.
Decades of overcriminalization have left between 70 million and 100 million Americans, or 1 in 3 of us, with some type of criminal record. Having a criminal record, even a minor one, can have lifetime consequences. It can make it hard to find a secure job, safe and stable housing, or get into college, no matter how long ago the crime occurred. Nearly half of all kids in the U.S. have at least one parent with some type of record, meaning the barriers that come with a record can have ripple effects for generations. In many cases, people are eligible to have their records cleared, but the vast majority don't ever get relief, whether because they can't afford a lawyer to pay the legal fees or figure out how to navigate the complex process. Many aren't even aware they're eligible. That's where clean slate policies come in. A clean slate allows certain types of records to be automatically cleared after a set amount of time has passed without a new conviction. That means your record isn't available to your future landlord or potential boss. Research shows why this makes sense. Someone with a prior conviction who stays crime-free for 4 to 7 years is no more likely to commit a crime in the future than anyone else. But because nearly 9 in 10 employers use criminal background checks in hiring, job applicants with records are half as likely to get a callback from an employer. As a result, any record, no matter how old or minor, can be a life sentence to joblessness. Clean slate laws are catching on. In June of 2018, Pennsylvania became the first state to enact clean slate into law, helping hundreds of thousands of its citizens move on with their lives and provide for their families. Now, a bunch of additional states are developing their own clean slate bills, and bipartisan clean slate legislation was recently introduced in the U.S. Congress. Americans may not be able to agree on much right now, but clean slate is something we can all get behind. That's why 70% of us, including political leaders on both the left and right, think it's a good idea. A clean slate is essentially an agreement. If you remain crime-free, you will get a second chance. It's not just the fair thing to do, it's common sense.
So that's what clean slate is in a nutshell. Started in Pennsylvania. What happens in Pennsylvania now is if you've remained 10 years incident-free from an encounter with the criminal justice system, the next morning you wake up, you're going to get a notification that says all of your misdemeanors no longer exist, except for within the court records and law enforcement. It'll be illegal for a landlord or a potential employer to do a background check on you discover that you've had a conviction, that person's going to get in trouble who gave that information and then to discriminate against you. So that's what we like to see happen in Michigan. Yes.
How do they land on the 10-year? Like,
I don't know.
They said in the slide that a person who doesn't commit a crime between 4 to 9 years statistically is not likely to commit a crime.
between 4 to 9?
4 to 7.
4 to 7.
But see, 10 years just seems like if you can't get a job for 10 years, it seems like you're already likely to be, possibly like going bad.
I'd like to speak with you about that.
Okay.
Well,
So-
it's a catch-22 because you have a recidivist rate of 95%.
Right.
So you can jail and you can catch a case depending on what your probation is.
So you agree to 10 years to $2
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to talk to you too. The reason why I say that is what we've done is for the past month and a half, we've done 12 community listening sessions across the state. Unfortunately, we haven't went too far north where I'd like to travel. I'd like to be brave and see what's happening up there. But the outcome that we've come away with, and we've had retired state police, we've had retired captains of the police force, we've had prosecutors. Our turnout actually, what's Julia? Julia is a partner of ours called Michigan Liberation, who helped organize one of our listening sessions in Pontiac. She'd love to talk to you. So what we came away with was collectively as a community who has decided to take people who've done bad things and send them away from our communities are now saying that, well, we'd be willing to go beyond misdemeanors. We'd be willing to include felonies. We'd be willing to say 10 years is too long. We'd be willing to say maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. What about after a person completes their obligation to the court? What about if I do my parole, I become actually what is called a returning citizen, and just don't call me a returning citizen, call me a citizen. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Yes, that we realize that mass incarceration is a big business, and the comparison of mass incarceration and slave trade, as far as slave control. So you got to realize, when you break it down, systematically, you're trying to break the head of the household. When you do that, like with Section 8, so you can have your husband in the house. So with that said, your son and your daughter don't have that male influence. And also in the city of Detroit, the gentrification is, I'm gonna be politically correct to a certain degree. We all, kids, I'm not gonna say anything, but gentrification, you see it. I was there like last week or the week before, and everything is like a lot of these kids here, young kids here. They're here for a reason. Downtown is for colonizers. The place that we're here today is for them to take over. That's the reality. Mass incarceration is a big business. Just like slave control.
I'd like to talk to you about two things.
Yes, sir.
One, what are we going to do about getting our country to amend the 13th Amendment of the Constitution? And two, how are we going to empower the heads of the household so they can be economically empowered?
First of all.
So here we are. So here we are,
Only heads of household.
a room full of people who have the ability to bring forth change in the society that we live in. So
That's what happens when you don't get the likelies walking around. People are shouting at
I don't mind, and I say that because, I'm ruminating right now because the question is how do we as a society address the issues while addressing each person's individual concern, because it's my job. My job is to not go back to Lansing and say, let's pass an irresponsible law to make some people happy. right?
Well, I mean, it's the root cause of it. They follow the money. There's no incentive to change the process. People charge $20 a day for room and board when they're in jail. That money's going to the
They call it debtor's prison. I was watching,
Okay.
$100 a day, Grand Rapids.
I mean, you're in jail because you don't have money, and then you get charged.
I was watching, so I'm gonna challenge everybody here, and I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'm gonna give it back to our professor. I was watching an interview the other night where a presidential candidate was asked, what is he prepared to do about the gun control? And he started to outline his big plan, which I'm not gonna do, which I can't do, about the overuse of incarceration. I have my own thoughts. My organization has its own strategies. We work with other organizations who have their own plans. But as I was watching him, what I would have liked to hear him say, what are you prepared to do? Because at the end of the day, it's the people. Whether we decide to vote or not, whether prison is based on an economic system where people profit off of it, and we think that people with money put people in positions of power because of their money, at the end of the day, it falls on our shoulders. The president is the president because some voted and some didn't. Mass incarceration or overuse of incarceration works and exists because some challenge it and some don't. Some vote and some don't. So at the end of the day, I guess, apart from everything that I've been given the opportunity to come here and say, I think the most effective and efficient and responsible thing that I can say is not what do we say from Justice Michigan do as an individual, isolated organization do to address the issue of the overuse of incarceration in Michigan, but it's to challenge you to say, what will you do with your degree, with your wealth or not, with your social influence or not? What will you do to stop it, to give little buddy a good life? I got you, brother. To give people who, I just have to give a couple of statistics. I can't real quick. Between 1996 and 2016 in the state of Michigan, residents of this state have been given up to almost $700,000 felony convictions in a 10-year span. As it stands, 300,000 people who are residents of Michigan will receive some form of conviction in this state. Tonight, almost 60,000 people who have loved ones will go to sleep in a jail or a prison. And almost 250,000 people are living under some form of correctional control in this state. Now, as an offender, I can't say that some people, all of them, unless they're innocent, all of them have some cause for being there, given the system that we function in. We like to talk about restorative solutions to conflicts or offenses, that some things can be resolved without using incarceration, jail, etc. But the reality is, we're all people. The organization that we work with has a hashtag that they're pushing called I Am Human. And we found a way to, as Alia said, to dehumanize people, to otherize people, to say they're bad people. But right now, I'm having conversations with a Latinx organization who's saying that we're dealing with our past bad actions by saying we would like to come to your country. We're not bad people. We're not like them. And just that insinuation alone implies that we're not like them. So everyone goes around in the room pointing the finger and saying we're not like them, we're not like them. One thing that kind of came to me while I was in prison, a friend of mine was pushing a mop. He's doing 5 years for drunk driving, and I'm doing 25 years for almost killing somebody, and he says, look, man, I'm not like these guys. I just had a drunk driving conviction. And so the drunk driver says, at least I'm not a thief. The thief says, at least I'm not an armed robber. Armed robber says, at least I ain't selling dope to kids. At least I'm not selling dope to kids. Drug dealer says, at least I'm not a rapist. The rapist says, at least I'm not a pedophile. Pedophile says, at least I'm not a snitch. And the snitch says, at least I'm not a drunk driver. So who's right and who's wrong? At the end of the day, they're all in that same boat. So my faith says when Jesus was on the cross and the two clowns were on the other side of him, they're mocking him and making fun of him as a prophet. But one of them comes to his senses and says, hey man, when you get there, don't forget me. Because he gets it. He needs help. And I think that's the point of this all. We need each other. If this system, if this country, if the way an individual feels isolated, otherized, is ever going to happen, it's going to happen because of us. Or not. Oh, you wanted to say something, and then I'll leave it at that.
My daughter spoke on 26 years of my, 27 years. My name is Blair Anderson. I am a former member of the original Black Panther Party. I was one of the organizers of the street gangs that you guys are studying, the Blackstones, and one of the founding members came up with that school of our civil rights movement. Something was said, slavery. You know, with 36 years on 2 sentences, and I saw hundreds of thousands of young men click, clack out of themselves back into them. The same 100,000 never made it back to a cell. There was always somebody on that yard who died because the criminally insane are incarcerated with you because you made a simple mistake and hit somebody too hard and you or you hurt them. You know, a regular fight. And then you're thrown in there and it causes a mutation. It causes an adaptation. You have to survive, right? You got to survive in prison. And everybody there, everybody is scary. Hundreds of thousands of men and women tortured. I had not one day of peace in 36 years. I've got stab wounds all over my body. I was an activist, revolutionary in prison, so I fought for you middle class people who made the mistakes. You know, we ran the programs and we tried to protect the people in the programs and the projects. But I just wanted to, drive this home, what our country has done. It is slavery. Talking about chains, gun towers, men and women in gun towers who get awarded if they shoot somebody on the yard. They get a good shoot hard, and it's called therapeutic, right? After a cop shoots a child down, they need some therapy. And the culture does what? It rewards it. Okay, so I just wanted to drop that. The solution comes from you. I agree, the legislative approach. But the greatest and most effective approach, the approach that has helped me to survive after 26 years in prison, is a restorative community approach. You have to use these educations, use these privileges, use your white privilege, use it, use your privilege. People of color, we have to use this education, we have to use that privilege to help build communities that restore those who have paid their price, have paid a price according to whatever unjust laws. If they've done that time, They should be free of the burden of that crime. 36 years in prison. I promise you that I could have been let go 5 years, 7 years.
And then
So that's it.
he was in the Hampton House in Chicago as a teenager. And so the part about the policing Black power, right? When they came in on him and his friends, he was asleep in bed. He happened to be holding a gun. He would confess that the gun saved his life. I would argue differently in favor of gun control, like the rest of my peers who are advocating for gun control. But, you know, after that point, he was 17, he never got back on the other side of the equation to have a regular job, to live sort of a regular life. And I mean, that sort of drives home the point of like, once you choose this other underground society, it's really hard to get out. You choose social association, you choose skill sets, you choose value systems.
When we're talking about choice, it's like, who am I? I'm the eldest son of my entire bloodline. My dad and my mom had 9 children. I'm the eldest son of all my cousins in a very violent environment. My dad said, boy, take this gun and protect our family. Your mama and your daddy got to work. White supremacy is what he had to protect you. White folks, we had bought a house, our first home in our entire bloodline. And white folks were burning down houses. And so my father, who apologized to me before he died while I was in prison, said, boy, the reason I never abandoned you through all of that is because you became what I need you to become to save the majority of our families. And what you'll find is that crime is economic. Many of the young men and women who choose to become criminals trying to make a living, not trying to sell you some dope and fuck your life up. You know, trying to make a living. You're out there robbing, risking your life. You're trying to make some money. You rationalize it and all other kind of stuff comes up. And then when we look at the black community, what we'll find from my generation, the Panthers, the mega street gangs, is that we were organizing against y'all's parents. For real. We were mobilizing because white folks beat a man to death in front of me with a baseball bat when I was like 11, 12 years old with 5, 6 of my little brothers and sisters walking to McDonald's. And so my daddy said, well, boy, next time you go up there, take one of the guns. When the kids go out, take one of the guns, say, try not to get in no trouble. Well, boy, you got to protect them. So I'm just saying we have to, really, really, really think about this. And I'm not, I don't want to blame you, but our culture has to change. We need restorative communities. You can do this shit.
All right.
All right, I was going to initially invoke facilitator privilege and direct some questions to the speakers, but I think it's more important that we create that space amongst the classroom. Craig, you wanted to raise something?
Well, I wanted to ask a question about ways several of the speakers, who are all wonderful, are encouraging and challenging folks in the room, who are not just college students, by the way. There's people from around the city in the room also. How do we get involved in what Force Detroit is doing, what Fair and Just in Michigan? Give us some concrete. There's a lot of people in this room who have learned a lot in the class, but there's also a lot of craving for becoming involved, wherever we're from. And so however we want to get involved, give us some concrete ideas.
Well, I think that Alia is more boots on the ground in Detroit than I am. So she can tell you how to get involved more directly in social things happening in this area. I live in Warren. I live out on Van Dyke and 11 miles, so I ain't even from Detroit. However, the organizations who I am partnering with We're doing more community listening sessions in the Detroit area. We're doing trainings for people who have been directly impacted to be able to tell their stories. We have 2 media campaigns that we're working on with national organizations who will be collecting stories and testimony from people who've been directly impacted. They're spending a lot of money on it. We're doing trainings on how to become, how to engage your legislator, because at the end of the day, you are the constituents. Fortunately, from this area, you got a lot of Democrats who are up there, so you don't have to argue or try to squeeze off a Republican to get them to do what you want to. I say it's like McDonald's. You go to McDonald's, you order a Big Mac, and somebody shoves you a fish sandwich. That's kind of what's happening. When you have a good rep, they give you a Big Mac. They're going to try to do their job for you. So you have some reps down here who are very engaging. But I got our brochures back there with our contact information. If you'd like any information on how we're engaging Detroit, pick one up, shoot us an email, and you'll get on our mailing list, and we'll tell you exactly how we're active in the Detroit area and what we're doing, how you can get directly involved, and hopefully how you can bring your networks and associations to bear on that as well.
So if you live in Detroit, well, first of all, you can donate. You can always donate at any time to support the work that allows us to hire people, to canvas, door knock. I mean, that's the important part, right? Like, we're in spaces like this all the time because we are paid to be in spaces like this. We need to be on Finkel and Hubble, right? Door knocking. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to hire people. So please donate. My organization, the internet address for it is forcedetroit.org. So that's forcedetroit.org. Please donate. Sign up for the newsletter list. There's always stuff happening. There's a Ban the Box coalition right now where you can call your state rep and advocate that they support that legislation. There is work, I'm sure you found out about the green light work happening. You can be involved in that. The more you actively become involved, there will be opportunities that unfold.
Okay, so yeah, just sign up. There is My Liberation over there in the corner. Julie is still there. There's work that BYP 100 is leading around the surveillance in Detroit that's deeply connected to this issue, right? They're going to keep that data indefinitely. Who knows who's going to benefit from it? Who knows what they're going to do with our images? Who knows how these billionaires who actually own it will use and process that information? There is, like I said, a Ban the Box initiative. We want you to call your state rep and ask that they support Cynthia Johnson's measure to ban the box. Is much more progressive. So Cynthia Johnson is advocating that we ban the box, not just on, sort of federal employment forms, but also on those vendor forms. So that gets into private industry, which is super progressive. That's much further than we usually get. So and sign up to be a part of a working group. So there are a number of organizations that this class has put you in contact with. If you like somebody's approach, sign up, give them a call, sign up for the newsletter, stay involved, be active, show up to city council, make some phone calls, knock some doors.
Put up my presentation again. I don't have anything. I'm a historian, so I listen mostly and read, and sometimes write and talk. But if you go maybe one or two more down, I saw a woman in a coffee shop today wearing a shirt that said "Cite Black Women." So I was like, okay, let me do that. And this comes from, Critical Resistance, which was founded by Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore. And these are some of the ideas that they have. about how to pursue policies that would sort of help decarcerate, or as they say, abolitionist steps in policing. So that includes when evaluating, it's like an approach to the reforms that people put on the table. And so what they're hoping to have in these reforms is, does it reduce funding to the police? Does it reduce the tools, tactics, and technology police have at their disposal? Does it reduce the scale of policing, right? Because in my work, what you see in Detroit is a massive increase in the scale of policing, both the types of crimes that they're pursuing and their presence in the neighborhoods, right? And then finally, does it challenge the notion that police increase safety? So those are some of the things that Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore suggest about these types of approaches to reforms, without having anything of my own to add.
I have a question. You mentioned ban the box. Maybe I missed something. What box are you referring to?
Yeah. I can go grab my cell phone and give you the specific bill number and all of this stuff. But on an employment application, there's a box that asks you, have you been convicted of a felony, yes or no? So it is that box that we are trying to get removed from, literally as many employment applications as possible.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Questions?
How do you feel about young white men predominantly? Because I haven't seen this among young white women. But how do you feel about young affluent white men who go out and sell drugs even though they don't have to, because they come from these affluent backgrounds, but they do it as a form of, mockery to black culture, or trying to be down, or just feeling that they need to do this to kind of fit in with black culture?
I feel like it's foolish. Can I say something? I was driving from downtown Detroit 2 days ago. I got a phone call from a woman from Grand Haven, Michigan. Familiar with it? Grand Haven's on the shoreline of Lake Michigan, affluent community. And she said, my grandson's getting out of prison. He went to prison last year. He spent some time in boot camp, and he's coming home. He has a heroin addiction. I said, what did he go to prison for? He said he sold his friend some heroin, and it killed him. And he went and turned himself into the police and said, I gave my friend some heroin, and he's dead. I'm responsible for that. They knew that he was dead. They were looking for what the cause was, got on his conscience. So he went and turned himself in, said, I gave him the drugs. So when you ask that question about ethnicity and the ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system, I wonder if in Detroit, a young man gives his friend heroin or sells it to him, and he dies, and he wants to do the right thing and goes down to the police and say, yeah, the guy who died off that dope, I gave it to him. Keep in mind, the boy went to prison last year. He's coming home this year. So I know too many people in prison who, for selling one $5 rock, got 5 years. So, there's the disparity issue. It's, again, a social problem. And the question is how do we develop some level of equality or equity with, the way people are judged within the system? I say it's a hard fight, and good luck with that. But again, I say it's foolish for somebody to try to mock another person by doing what they do, especially when it's wrong.
Yeah, I feel like there are some layered conversations that we need to have around race. I feel like, we need to be thinking about how we build bridges to make a better society, right? And then we need to be thinking about how people break those bridges when it comes time to fulfill those promises with us. So I feel like those are some of the most important conversations that we need to have. And because in movement history, right, when it comes time to honor a promise between, like for instance, the white feminist movement has repeatedly broken alliances with black women, with women of color overall, right? And And so, you know, we need to have those conversations. But I really feel like if we are being, like, if we're moving from a space of like moral sort of high ground, which is a lot of the premise of this work, right? Then we don't entertain conversations like that, right? That's just him being silly. He's a kid, right? Like all these other kids that do little kiddie stuff and end up in trouble to varying degrees. So just like we want somebody to empathize with, I want somebody to empathize with my babies one day as they grow up. We should empathize with him. That's what I think.
Can I make a comment right quick? I think one of the things that we need to do, the black community needs to do in Detroit. I'm a lifetime Detroiter, and I've raised 4 boys. All of them went to college. All of them graduated. None of them ever went to jail. I'm not bragging about that, but it was a job keeping them out of trouble and out of jail. Now, one thing that has happened in our community, has happened all over the country, the police or the courts have interfered with the way that we raise our children. Now, I can say to any black person that I did this one day in front of my dad. And they'll look at me and they say, "You did that?" You know, we all understand, my people, we all understand. You don't do that in front of your father. There's consequences for swelling up in front of your father. Now, none of my sons ever swelled up in front of me like I did my dad. But when I did that, my dad was showing me something. Basically, it was women first. We had come from church, my younger sister and my cousin, female cousin, sister. My dad had unlocked the door. He opened the door, pushed the door open, then he stepped aside. And I stepped in first. And I felt my daddy's hand slap me on the top of my back. And he grabbed my suit jacket and snatched me out the door. Well, all my little buddies were around, they were outside, the guys that I played basketball with. I didn't think that was, I didn't like him doing that in front of them. So we got in the house and my dad, he went in and greeted my mother and he got ready to go upstairs. And I was standing in the living room. And he happened to glance back at me and he says, "Do we have a problem?" And that's when I swelled up. But I knew that I was doing the wrong thing. But once you take that breath in, you already swell up, so you got to blow it out before you speak. And I was about to say, "Well, Daddy, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean." But before I said that, my daddy did something that he'd be put in jail for today. But I'm glad he did it. It was necessary. Because I certainly would have done that to my son. And y'all can call the police now, because but it's too late. But anyway, my dad hit me in the chest. I don't remember the wind being knocked out. All I remember is seeing both of my feet like this in front of me. And I was like, "Damn, whose feet are those?" So I fell over the coffee table. And the coffee table had magazines neatly spread on the coffee table. And with my legs on top of the coffee table and my back on the floor, my mother screamed in. She was in the kitchen. She just happened to be frying chicken that day for Sunday dinner. And she screamed, what's going on in there?" And my dad said, "Oh, nothing. We just having a little talk." And he turned around and goes upstairs. Well, now I'm looking at the coffee table on the floor, the magazines all on the floor. I know that woman ain't got sense enough to understand that that guy upstairs did this. So I had to hurry up and straighten up her house. But the main thing that I want to say is that the men in the community, we don't have to be in an organization, but we can be activists in our community. Every community I've lived in, and I had 2 houses, you know, when I was married, and every community I lived in, I was married for 30 years. All the children, if they didn't know my last name, they called me Mr. Willie. All the children had respect for me. And all my sons had respect for me. And that's why they didn't end up in the criminal justice system. But I'm telling you, they went to school. And several times, I had to go to school to save these boys from the discipline that the school was going to dole out. They wanted to destroy my boys in the school system for doing, boys are silly, for doing little silly stuff in the school system. They wanted to destroy them right here in Detroit. And I told them on one occasion, is this the best that you can do for an honor roll student at your school, an accomplished musician at your school, an exemplary citizenship student at your school? Is this the best that you can do? It's offer to destroy my child? Well, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to let you. So it didn't happen. And that boy, that man, was teaching at a college in South Carolina just last year. All of these boys graduated from school, college. There's some beautiful, beautiful young men. And I'm happy I did everything I did to keep them out of trouble. From hitting them in their shoulder, to socking them in the chest. And I only whipped 3 of them once. And that was for stealing. Well, I've been put in jail today. But that was for stealing. And they haven't been to jail for stealing either. I took care of that. So we can't leave it to the police to discipline our children.
Yeah, because
you can't spank them, but they'll shoot them and kill them, or put them in jail for 30 years.
Yeah, and
So we gotta do something.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say that, you know, I addressed that. We got a whole separate system, right? Like, our system as parents has not changed. They would put us in jail for chewing bubblegum and walking a straight line. We don't have anything to lose in that regard. Like, if we don't teach our children discipline, then when they bustle up at the police like you did your father, they'll die, right? And that's the reality that, you know, black and brown people face. And so we're walking a hard line.
Well, we need, just as the police need training, we need training. We need to train our children how to survive and encounter with the police. If it's just a traffic stop, our children need to understand you cannot do what they do. If you got an argument, take that argument up in court, but you can't do what they do out on the street. You're not going to get a slap on the wrist. We have to let our boys know that, especially when they stop them, the police stop them.
And our girls find the blame.
They say, what you stop me for? Don't show that attitude. Yes, officer. Yes, be respectful. And don't escalate the situation, because all it takes is a little bit. And if they shoot you, you know they're going to get away with it. You know they're going to get off. Because the Dred Scott case is still on the books. A black man has no right in America that a white man is obligated to respect. He can respect it if he feels like it, if he don't feel like it. That's why the police get off on a lot of things that they get off. And we don't understand that that's still on the books. And so, I mean, it's just there. I'll sit down, shut up.
I hate to be the heavy right now, but in the interest of respecting our hosts here at Cast Commons, we do need to wind down the conversation. So I invite everyone to please thank our panelists. I would also encourage all of you to stop by the table in the back on your way out, get the literature that's there, that Troy mentioned, the Alia reference. And please, if you're interested in getting involved in using your resources, using your assets to work on this pressing issue, please stay, chat with our panelists, and get